Hello and welcome to our first event of the 2021 virtual edition of Words, London's Literary and Creative Arts Festival. I'm Josh Lambier, the Artistic Director of the festival, coming to you live from Museum London in London, Ontario. As we gather together virtually, weathering these very unusual pandemical times, I also want to situate us in the territory on which this event is zooming to you, from near and far. Museum London is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected to the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be the home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and water and as vital contributors to our community and to the Words Festival. I'm zooming to you not too far from Deshkenzibing, also known as the Thames or Antler River. If you've been to Museum London, the home of our festival, you'll know that it's located at the Forks, a place of historical significance for Indigenous communities in the region. It is my privilege to have the opportunity to host tonight's distinguished guest, two-time winner of the Stephen Leacock Memorial Medal for Humor Writing, Terry Fallis, who will be joining us to talk about his new best-selling novel, Operation Angus, the long-awaited follow-up to The Best Laid Plans and The High Road. The Words Festival is coming to you to the safety and comfort of your home to bring the brightest writers who are grappling with issues of pressing concern, making us laugh, commiserating with human sorrow, and confronting big ideas. At a time when our public debate is mediated too often by 240 character volleys back and forth on Twitter, we want to step out of the fray for a moment for in-depth conversations with our authors, tarrying a while, no pun intended, to focus our attention on their books. Over the next hour or so, we're going to engage with Terry's book and his work, and we're going to take your questions in the chat and on the webinar's Q&A function. So send along your cogitations and questions to join the discussion as we go along. I will be here to bring those questions out of the chat and Q&A and ping pong them over to Terry and await his returns. On our opening night, I would also like to recognize the generous support of the Ontario Arts Council, the London Arts Council, Scotia Wealth Management, and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. Financial support that allows us to keep this festival free during the pandemic. And it's a month-long festival for free. My warm thanks to Museum London's staff and to all of our community partners. We couldn't deliver the Words Festival without you. I'd like to start us off tonight a little uncharacteristically with a personal story. When the coronavirus tore into our lives like a hurricane 20 months or so ago, my father, a now retired banker, widower, and obsessed golf enthusiast, found he had an unexpected amount of unwanted time free at home, even more time than a retiree would already have now that he couldn't go to the golf course every morning. Our unprecedented times, to evoke a phrase that's been quite overused in 2020, led to a most truly unprecedented question from him. Can you recommend a book I can read while I'm stuck at home? I was gobsmacked. In all of my years studying literature, talking about books, organizing a festival, he had never asked me this question ever before. The pressure was on to deliver the right suggestion. I said, yes, I think I have something you'd like. It's by Terry Fallis. It's called Albatross. It's about a young golf prodigy who skyrockets to sports stardom, and yet he doesn't really like golf but wants to become a writer. I gave him my copy on a Friday. By the beginning of the next week, I get a call. Well, I finished the book. It was terrific. What else can you recommend? So I sent him a copy of The Best Laid Plans, the first novel in our series on the accidental politician Angus McLintock and his relapsed Politico sidekick, Daniel Addison. When Operation Angus emerged to the world, it was the fourth Terry Fallis novel my father's now picked up. You have to understand, Terry has accomplished a feat that neither I nor my brothers could ever achieve over the years. He got my father reading, even when the golf courses opened back up. So this is an achievement that I would consider of an historic proportion in our family. I'm offering this personal story to illustrate the power of Terry's writing, and more generally, the power of literature to lift us up during a difficult time. I can't think of a better reason, a better driving motivation to host a literary and creative arts festival. That's why we do this. I challenge everyone over the next month of the Words Festival to tune into an author you know, like Terry, but also find someone you don't know in our lineup and check them out. You never know where you'll find your next favorite author, just like my father. It is a real pleasure to welcome someone who I and many others regard as one of Canada's finest humorists and comedic novelists. His first novel, The Best Laid Plans, I mentioned earlier, won the 2008 Leacock Medal for Humor, was named the 2011 winner of CBC's Canada Reads, and became a CBC television series and stage musical. In 2015, he won the Leacock Medal a second time for his fourth novel, No Relation. Terry Fallis, welcome back to London's Words Festival.
Wow, Josh, thank you so much for those very kind words. And I love that story. It's why I turned my camera on, because what a touching story. And I hope I get a chance to meet your father at some point. That's great news. And thanks for inviting me. So nice to be here. I really wish we could all be together as we have been in the past when I've been to Words. But this is better than not meeting at all. So I am really thrilled to be here with you. I hope that we'll have a chance to have some questions later on in the event, but I'm going to share my screen and have a little chat with you about my current novel. Let me just try and make sure I can do this. There we go. And then go there. There, I hope that's visible to everybody. I think it probably is. Josh very kindly mentioned my first novel. That's where this all began, really, back in 2008. When I finished it, and it seemed to do reasonably well, far better than I thought it ever would. I quickly wrote a second in the series, The High Road, in 2010. And after that, you know, it was not my intention ever to come back to Angus and Daniel and the rest of the crew from these first two novels. I was a little worried about sort of being pigeonholed as a political satirist, and I really wanted to see whether I could write other novels, you know, with the same kind of comedic tone, I hope, but not just about politics. So I spent the next 11 years writing 5 more novels, none of which featured the characters from these first two. But now I have come back to Operation Angus, and there's a reason I've come back. And again, it starts with this novel. More people in Canada have read The Best Laid Plans than have read any of my other novels. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and it'll probably always be that way. Many writers sort of have one book of their flock of books that often is the most popular. This won the Leacock Medal in 2008, which was an extraordinary shock to my system. This was the first novel I had ever written of any length. At the time it won the Leacock Medal, it was self-published. I couldn't find a publisher even to send me an automated rejection letter. And somehow, miracles of miracles, it wins the Leacock Medal, which led to finally landing a literary agent and a mainstream publisher, McClellan and Stewart, Penguin Random House in my case. A couple of years later, as Josh kindly mentioned, it won Canada Reads. I sort of felt the Leacock Medal made me a writer. Canada Reads makes anyone who wins Canada Reads becomes a bestseller. And it's not always because the book is so awesome, although I hope the book is pretty good. It's just that Canada Reads imprimatur that sits on the front of the novel, because Canada Reads sells more books in this country than anything else except for the Giller Prize. So it's a blessing for any writer, particularly a rookie writer at the time, to win Canada Reads. If that weren't enough, Josh also mentioned in 2014, it was a 6-part television miniseries. which was so much fun to be. I was just only peripherally involved. I reviewed the scripts and made comments and that kind of thing. I was on the set for several days of shooting. And as you can see by that picture in the lower right, I actually had a cameo in the 6th episode, which if you happen to sneeze at the wrong moment or go to the refrigerator for a drink, you might have missed it. But it was fun to be able to be involved with that. And if that weren't enough, a year later, it debuted in Vancouver as a stage musical, which was all sorts of fun in a different way than the TV series. So I have been blessed beyond belief on my first novel. So it is the novel that keeps on giving, and it has led to the answer to the question, why bring Angus back? And it's sort of easy to answer. Somebody emailed me about a month ago now, and the person emailed me, said that he had gone through my entire website and counted up all of the speaking engagements that I have done on my books since 2008. And then he proceeded to congratulate me that I've done over 1,000 book talks in that period. I had no idea I had done that many, and I'm not sure why he felt the need to count them all, but he did. But what I can tell you, because I was there for all 1,000 or so of those book talks, is that in the Q&A period, regardless of what book I'm talking about, somebody will put their hand up and say, thank you for coming and seeing us. This new novel you've written is terrific, blah, blah, blah. Thank you very much. But nothing will ever top the best laid plans. When is Angus coming back? And it's not always what a writer loves to hear, that he peaked on his first novel and has been on a slow and steady decline ever since. Actually, I'm kidding. I don't feel that at all. If a writer, any writer, in any of his books or her books can make a connection with the reader and have the characters strike a chord with Canadians in this case, that's a huge blessing and something that all writers, I think, long for. So I'm thrilled that even though it was my first novel, that those characters seem to have connected with Canadians in a way that has prompted this question I get at every reading and talk or festival appearance I do: when is Angus coming back? And I finally decided, why am I fighting this? Why do I not just write another Angus novel? And that's what I have done. So the answer to the question is quite short. When is Angus coming back? He's coming back now by popular demand. So let me tell you a little bit about this story and the novel and where it comes from. So first of all, starting with the title, it's a 2-word title. I contributed the word Angus to the title because it seemed to me that when you have an 11-year hiatus between Angus novels, there's a marketing benefit of sorts, an awareness benefit of sorts, promotional benefit, to put the word Angus in the title, so that when Josh is walking through his university bookstore and passes the Canadian fiction shelves and he sees a book called Operation Angus by me, he might think, oh, maybe he's brought back Angus. So I just wanted people to know that after 11 years, Angus was back. So that was why I wanted that word, that name in the title. But this guy contributed the other word, operation. Around the same time as I was planning this novel, this guy, Phil Gursky, a great guy, emailed me and asked if he could sit down with me to talk about marketing his own books, because he is a prolific writer as well. I didn't mean as well as me, I just meant as well as being a terrorism analyst. And he was with CSIS for many years. He was in charge of intelligence gathering in the Privy Council office. He's a really interesting guy who has spent his entire life in the intelligence community in Canada. And when he emailed me, not knowing that I was contemplating writing a book that would almost be described as a comic spy thriller that involved intelligence communities and organizations, he just called to say, can we meet and talk about book marketing? And I said, by all means. I was very keen to meet with him, but though he didn't know why at the time. So we met in a Starbucks in downtown Toronto, and we talked a lot about book marketing, and I shared whatever modest wisdom I had about book marketing. And then I said, by the way, I'm thinking about writing a novel that involves intelligence communities. And then I described the story to him, and we had a great chat. I asked him lots of questions. He very gamely answered them. He taught me a lot about how intelligence organizations work. And some of content of this story is because I sat down with an intelligence expert. And he suggested the word operation because most intelligence agencies, including those in Canada, each of their missions or cases is called an operation internally. So calling something Operation Angus is quite possible. He also talked to me a bit about, the politics that can go on within intelligence communities, and all of that plays a role in this story. So if when you read this, and I hope you do read it, you find the story seems to be approaching plausibility, that's largely because I spent time with a former intelligence analyst. And in fact, I'm sitting down with him next week for another coffee. He's coming back to Toronto and we're going to get together. So that's why it's called Operation Angus. And I thought the title was a good one when he suggested adding the word operation. Let me give you what I rather lamely call my novel in a nutshell. There's a lot going on in this story. I'm not going to share very much with you here because I really want you to come upon it in reading it. I think there's a danger if I go too far in what's going on in the story. So all of this is kind of, things that you find out very early on. But just to set it up, when the novel opens, relations between the Brits, the British government, and the Russian government are at an all-time low, largely because Russian intelligence operatives have been coming into Britain, England, and poisoning and sometimes killing former Russian dissidents or those who be critical of the Putin regime. And in the novel, that's how it sort of opens. And you're thinking, well, that's actually true. Well, that is true. So even though this is a novel that may seem a little far-fetched in places, its roots are in a real premise that we have now in the world. This is what's going on in England right now. So I built on reality to create this story. There is an MI6 agent with a conscience who is at the center of this story. There is evidence of an assassination plot that's going to take place in Ottawa. And the assassination plot is against the life of the Russian president, who will be coming to Ottawa for a one-day meeting with the prime minister when they are both returning from the G8 summit in Washington. And they are going to meet in a brand new but very ugly building that is just opened in Ottawa, perched on the edge of a cliff on the other side of Parliament Hill, a stone's throw from Parliament's Hill, on Nepean Point. There is a pretty sheer cliff that goes straight down into the Ottawa River. And this new building is, on paper, it was quite a beautiful glass and steel structure shaped like a maple leaf. If you were to look down from above, it would be this beautiful maple leaf that is kind of stuck into the cliff, cantilevered out from the cliff. And what they discovered is that the cliff actually couldn't withstand the pressures of this cantilevered building, even though their engineering core samples said that it could. So at the 11th hour, they had to either tear the building down, which would have cost a huge amount of money, or put some braces on it so that it would still function. And they chose to do that. So instead of this pristine glass and steel building, they now have these big black braces above and below that make it look like there is a big tarantula walking across the cliff face in Ottawa. And it has spawned protests from those who are really dedicated to public architecture, and it's a bit of a disaster. So that's a little sideline with protesters showing up at the site and all of that. But throughout the novel, there's some politics, there's lots of secrets and tradecraft and spies. And importantly, Daniel and Angus are on their own. They have been given this intelligence about the evidence of this impending plot, this crisis, this major development in geopolitical terms, and they can't get anyone in Canada to believe them. And one of the reasons they can't is that they have agreed not to betray the confidence of the MI6 agent who has shared this this information. So it's Daniel and Angus's integrity has led to them being on their own to try and sort out this issue and beat the clock and thwart the assassination. I should also mention that the Nutcracker Suite, yes, the ballet, actually plays a role in this story. I just thought ballets always had a role to play in thrillers, but apparently not. But I'll come back to that because there's a reason for that. So that's a little bit of how the novel opens, at least. As far as settings are concerned, the novel begins in London, England. Angus, who is now a cabinet minister, is in charge of organizing this meeting between the prime minister and the Russian president. So he and Daniel are over in London for meetings with their Russian counterparts because the G8 is sort of planning their upcoming summit in Washington. So all of the officials are in London getting ready for the G8 in Washington, if you can follow that. So there's an important meeting between this disgruntled MI6 agent with a conscience in a London pub, not far from Daniel and Angus's hotel. After that, much of the story takes place in Ottawa, on Parliament Hill, on Nepean Point, where this building has been constructed to host the meeting. And of course, in the little town of Cumberland on the shores of the Ottawa River, where Angus lives, and Daniel too, and some of the other characters in this story. Finally, later in the novel, there is a trip to Moscow, and Angus and Daniel visit the Kremlin. They spend time and actually stay in the Canadian Embassy, which is that second picture. And I'm sure you're familiar with that third picture there. That's of course, the Chess Museum in Moscow. Yeah, I didn't know it was there either, but I figured there would be one, and lo and behold, there is. And that's actually a photograph of it. So those are the settings. Now, I'm always interested in why novelists write the stories that they do. I mean, have they just researched something they know nothing about and are going to try and make it work as a novel? Or are they picking pieces of their own life? And I certainly am a member in good standing. If you heard me speak before, you may have heard me say this. I'm a member of the Write What You Know school of writing. You can find pieces of me and pieces of my life strewn about the pages of my novels. Not in an autobiographical sense. I am not writing about me. I do not figure in these novels. But I do find it easier to write with authority and conviction and authenticity, which I think is what writers want to do, if I'm writing about something that I've experienced before, or am passionate about, or am really interested in, curious about. And that has guided me through all 8 of my current novels and the 9th novel that I'm working on right now. So I thought I would sort of trace the roots of this novel and how they connect with my own life, which I hope allows me to write at least portions of the novel with a bit more authority than I would if I were simply writing about something I knew nothing about. So first of all, why am I writing about politics and Ottawa? Well, that's easy. I have to go back to 1984 for this, which was my baptism by fire in politics. I was just leaving McMaster University at the time. I was finishing my term as president of the Students' Union. And at that time, Jean Chrétien was locked in a rather ferocious battle with John Turner for the leadership of the Liberal Party. And I somehow, miraculously, I don't know why, because I had no formal experience in party politics. I just knew I was a liberal, having searched my soul and researched all the ideologies that I might have lined up with. And I realized that I was a liberal, despite my family's rather uh, multiple generations of experience and dedication to the Conservative Party. I was the liberal in our family. And I landed a job on Jean Chrétien's leadership campaign, a full-time job. I would have licked envelopes and marked voter lists for free as a volunteer, but I landed a job. I became Ontario Youth Chair for the Jean Chrétien campaign. And yes, that is a shot of me from 1984, back when my hair was thicker and I was thinner. I have suffered a reversal in fortunes on both fronts in the intervening years. But I was in charge of a huge section of the Ottawa Civic Centre. All of those Chrétien supporters you can see behind me were my responsibility. You can see that the campaign spared no expense on the technology. As I donned my 1920s styles Bell Telephone headset, but it all seemed to work. And it was such a lot of fun. We threw ourselves into that campaign, thinking that Chrétien would win. And of course, our hopes and dreams were dashed when John Turner won the convention. So this was my arrival in politics. And I have to give John Turner credit. He knew that he was going to be calling an election within weeks of becoming prime minister, within weeks of this June leadership convention. The party was quite fractured at this stage because of leadership battles tend to do that. Camps are formed and there's bitterness and division and acrimony. And he wanted the party united. And what I thought was a smart move, he plucked, or his team plucked, a few people from each of the other competing leadership camps to come to Ottawa to join hands, join forces, unify the party, and join the government and work on the campaign. And I was still drying my tears back in Toronto after the Ottawa convention. And about 2 days after I got back from Ottawa, my phone rang. And 24 hours later, I had moved to Ottawa to join the Turner government. And I joined as a policy advisor to this guy, the Honorable Jean Lapierre. He was Minister of State for Youth. And I joined as a policy advisor because I had just spent the last 2 or 3 years working in the national and provincial student movement in this country through my time in student politics at McMaster. I joined the staff of the Minister of State for Youth. At the time, Jean Lapierre was the youngest cabinet minister in Canadian history. He was 28 years old and I was 24 years old. So we traveled the country together. He had a staff of probably about 6 or 7 political staffers. I was one of them. I wrote some policy papers for him. I wrote some speeches. I did campaigning. I remember one time just he and I and the pilot were in this rickety old Cessna airplane flying from Halifax to the wilds of Cape Breton, through what seemed like a force 5 gale. And we were landing in a small town in Cape Breton to do a speech for Alan McEachen fundraiser, because he was from Cape Breton. So I have really fond memories of that time. So that was my time in federal politics. I stayed for a year in opposition when our government was defeated by the Mulroney rout a few weeks later, and Jean Lapierre was reelected. So I stayed with him. He was international trade critic. And for the next year, I learned all about that policy area as we embarked on our free trade talks with the United States. So it was a great experience. I then spent 2.5 years at Queen's Park on the political staff of the finance minister. So that's why I'm writing about politics, because I, for a short time, was on the inside, both in government and in opposition. So I've been in those smoke-filled back rooms, and I've seen how government operates and where the pressure points are in the decision-making. And it was a fascinating and illuminating experience for me, also one that left me somewhat jaded and jaundiced, which is why I got out after 3 or 4 years. There was also an earlier connection I have to politics that might have had some influence in pushing me into politics, though I'm not sure. I have to go back to 1970 for this. I'm not sure some of you may have seen this photo. I think I used it in another one of my talks, but in 1970, I was 10 years old. There I am on the far left. That's my identical twin brother on the far right. But guess who this is in the back row? Well, friends, that is the Right Honorable Stephen Harper. It is true, in 1970, in Leaside, a small community in downtown Toronto, Stephen Harper and I played on the same hockey team. Even back then, he was a dedicated right winger, but he was also strong on defense. Sorry, you couldn't expect someone like me to pass up that low-hanging fruit. I actually have no memory of Stephen Harper. It wasn't long after this that he moved to Etobicoke, and then a couple of years later moved out to Calgary. So we went to different schools. There were 2 public schools in Leaside. He went to one, I went to the other. But he has confirmed his identity. In fact, I think this photo or another team photo that I think has my brother in it was in his hockey book. So anyway, so who knows if being on the team with the future prime minister happened to spark my interest in politics. I somehow doubt it. So why is Angus an engineering professor? Well, that's easy. My degree from McMaster is in engineering. I have a degree in mechanical and biomedical engineering, though I have not practiced engineering in the professional or formal sense for one instant in my life. However, I wear the iron ring with pride, and it's because I think very much like an engineer. I view the world through an engineer's lens, whether it's giving advice to my clients or figuring out how to cut the grass in our backyard in the most efficient way possible, very engineering thing to do, or how I write my novels. I write my novels the way you would expect an engineer to write novels. I engineer them. Engineers don't build bridges without blueprints. I don't write a novel without a plan, a blueprint, a very detailed outline. So it's very much an engineering approach for me. So I know that world very well. So that's why I made Angus an engineering professor. I also made him a grammarian because I am a grammarian courtesy of my father, who engendered that interest and that commitment to proper use of the language. So those of you who may have read any of my 3 novels featuring Angus will know that there is a hovercraft in the novel that Angus has designed and built. Well, in real life, I designed that hovercraft, and you see the depiction on the screen. I designed it while I was in university. It has never been built, though I dream one day that it might be, that it would spring off the pages of the novel and work just as effectively in reality as it does in the pages of the novel. But you're still wondering, what's with the hovercraft? Well, when I was 15, a classmate and I designed and built a full-sized hovercraft. It wasn't the same design as the one that is in the novel. This was a twin engine designed, a lift engine at the front, you can see it there, and a thrust engine in the back. So when I was not yet old enough to drive a car, apparently I was old enough to drive our hovercraft around the parking lot at the Ontario Science Centre, where it was on display and stored for several years thereafter. So I know far more than any sane individual ought to know about hovercrafts. And if you've read particularly my first novel, well, now you know more than any sane individual ought to know, because I kind of spared few details about the hovercraft. I probably put in far more than I ought to have, but it's because I know that much about them, so I put it in the novel. So that's why there's a hovercraft. There is some chess in the novel, and there's chess in the novel because I have been alternately interested in and obsessed by chess probably for 30 or 40 years now. And I've only lately, I think, figured out why chess appeals to me so much. First of all, it's a game that requires a very active left side of your brain. That side of your brain committed to logic and science and mechanics and rules. It's very kind of process oriented. And chess has lots of rules, and you've got to, there's a methodology to chess. So that's the left side of your brain. But chess also requires creative brilliance if you're going to succeed in the game. So it needs the right side of your brain as well, where that's the creative side of our brain. And chess is well known for the best chess players obviously adhere to the rules, they must, but there are moments of creative brilliance in chess that can only come from the right side of your brain. So you need both sides of your brain. And I think that's why game of chess appeals to me, because I think both sides of my brain they talk to one another, perhaps more so than I have a right to expect, which may explain why a mechanical engineer has written 9 novels and with a 9th on the way, 8 novels with a 9th on the way. So I think that may be why chess is in this novel, why I like chess and why I write novels. So why did I choose to turn this novel into a comic thriller of sorts? Why did I not just write another political satire like the first 2? Well, I always like to challenge myself with something new in each novel. So I don't want to repeat myself, even though if you've read more than one of my novels, you may see plenty of similarities across the novels. That's true, I concede that. But there's at least something different in each one that has been a conscious decision on my part to try and develop as a writer. If I think back to my 5th novel, I'm just looking at them on the shelf. Yeah, my 5th novel, One Brother Shy. The challenge I set for myself in that novel was to write a narrator, or write in a narrator's voice, a narrator who was not just humanly flawed the way all of my narrators are, usually a combination of helpless, hopeless, and hapless, but this was a narrator who was also damaged by trauma earlier in his life before the novel opens. And I'd never written a narrator who's been damaged by trauma and is struggling with it and still, in a way, in recovery from that and has changed who he is. So that was the challenge I set for myself there. In this novel, I've always enjoyed thrillers, spy stories, crime novels. When I was growing up, and to this day, I'm a huge fan of Sherlock Holmes. I think Arthur Conan Doyle writes some of the finest sentences I have ever read. I remember as a young person, I read my way through all of the John Buchan novels that had been bequeathed to me by my grandfather. They are early spy novels set in the 1910s, 1920s, in England mainly. Some of you have read them, and there is a Canadian angle there because John Buchan became Lord Tweedsmuir and eventually became, for a time, Governor General of Canada. As I got older, I read Frederick Forsyth novels, Robert Ludlum novels, and now, as I'm an older person now, I have been reading more contemporary thriller writers like Daniel Silva, and there aren't that many funny comic novels. I found 2 in my kind of passing through that genre. Robert Ludlum wrote a novel called The Road to Gandolfo, which has all of the hallmarks of a thriller, but also is very funny. The same with Hugh Laurie's, I think, under-promoted and not really well-known novel, The Gun Seller. Again, Hugh Laurie is a very funny guy, and he wrote this novel that brings those 2 ideas together, humor and a thriller. So I wondered whether I could write a comic novel that would make you laugh, but also had the high stakes of a thriller, where potential violence and danger are around every corner, where there's loss of life, perhaps, or world balance of power is hanging in the balance. And I don't know whether I've been able to do that. You will be the judges of that. But that was the one element that was different and something I had never done before in a novel. That was why this was a slightly different approach than my other 2 novels featuring Angus and Daniel. So I hope the novel still has the same tone and feel, and much of it still takes place on Parliament Hill. So there are some politics there. But there's this overlay of the thriller, and I wanted to do it just to see if I could. So I hope I've approached it at least. But there may be an earlier connection to my interest in thriller novels. When I was a younger man, like when I was 10, when my brother and I were 10, the three of us and a friend from down the street, we joined forces to create a clandestine organization called LAPI. Surely some of you have heard of it. Okay, probably not. Let me enlighten you. It stood for Leaside Amateur Private Investigators. We were 10 years old at the time. We were guided by the Hardy Boys Detective Handbook. We had code names. We had little business cards. We had, I wouldn't call them gadgets, but we had little tools that we used in the trade. We would sometimes go down to the Eaton Center and practice shadowing people with our walkie-talkies. And we had two cases, the case of a missing parking ticket and the case of the car that ran over a parking sign, a street sign, kitty corner to our house. We weren't very good at the private investigator business. In the last couple of years, we finally declared those two cases cold cases. They were unsolved. But our experience then has kind of become legendary within my own family. So when I'm hunting for my car keys sometime and can't find them, one of my smart alecky sons is likely to pipe up with, well, Dad, maybe this is a job for LAPI. So I will never live down this experience, but it did spark an early interest in detectives and crime detection and thrillers and spying. So anyway, I perhaps have come by it honestly. I promised to explain why the Nutcracker, the ballet, the Nutcracker Suite is in this novel. Well, for those of you who have come to see the Nutcracker in Toronto, the National Ballet production of it, they do it every year at Christmas time, and they have a tradition. They have a tradition of recruiting two local Toronto celebrities to play the role of the Cannon Dolls in a very short little part, a cameo appearance in the production just before the end of the first act. I think in this photo, I think that's Matt's son Dean who was there, but I know Margaret Atwood and Charles Pachter, who are good friends, the sculptor, the artist, I guess, a painter. They have done it before. I know Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner played the role. Kyle Lowry used to play with the Raptors, did it. And in 2019, clearly the National Ballet of Canada was scraping the bottom of the barrel for Toronto celebrities because I was invited to be a Cannon Doll, and I was supported by my son, my younger son, Ben, who is a graduate of theater school at Brock University. So we got the call, and when you get an experience like that, you don't turn it down, or an invitation like that. So it was lots of fun. We had to go early. It was a matinee performance. I don't think they would have risked me on an evening performance. It was a matinee on a Sunday afternoon. We had to go a couple hours before the show to learn our antics on stage and to get into our costumes. We were warming up in the same area. That one picture, you can see the bar behind in the mirror, warming up with all the other ballet dancers, including the prima ballerinas and the principal dancers. And we were just in the same room doing our little skits. And anyway, it was a lot of fun. Those photos were taken before our makeup was applied. But we watched the whole first half of the show from backstage, which was an extraordinary experience. You wouldn't believe how big it is back there. It dwarfs the stage. There's so much room and so much going on. And finally, it was our time to go out, and the Cannon Master led us out with the cannon, and we did our funny stuff on stage, and we had a lot of fun. We're literally on stage for about less than a minute, I think, but it was lots of fun. So when you have an experience like that is uncommon and few people will get a chance to do it, you put it in your next novel. And so I did. So Angus and Daniel are invited, at least, to be the Cannon Dolls in the touring production of the Nutcracker when it visits the National Arts Centre in Ottawa. And that's all I'll say about that part of the novel. I should just let you know that there is the audiobook version of this novel. I recorded it, so that may not be a bonus for you. It may not be a plus, a positive, but I recorded the audiobook. And so if you'd rather listen to a novel rather than read it, that is possible. So at this point, rather than taxing your time any further, why don't I read just a very brief section from the first chapter of the novel. I don't want to read any further along because it might be giving away details that I want you to come upon on your own. So I'm going to read from chapter 1, just a couple of pages. And in this scene, the novel opens with Daniel standing in a hotel corridor, having just knocked on Angus's door. They're in this hotel in London, England. An MI6 agent just asked me to meet her in an hour at a pub around the corner, I blurted out. And, well, and what, man? You're seeking advice on what to wear or who should pay? He stood in the doorway, decked out in pajama bottoms and a white t-shirt that proclaimed, "Hovercraft lovers do it on air." By the look of him, he'd been sound asleep when I knocked, mind you. Whether in the House of Commons or his boathouse workshop, day or night, his long hair and beard almost always looked as if he'd just driven through a hurricane in a convertible. Well, I don't really know. I guess I just wanted to tell somebody that I'm meeting a secret agent in a London pub late at night for a clandestine meeting. Well, Daniel, lad, by my reckoning, if you're saying that out loud in a hotel corridor, you haven't quite grasped the fundamentals of the spy game. Did she actually use the words clandestine meeting? Well, no, I guess I'm just projecting, given the circumstances and all. Well, you'd better come in. I'm bleeding awake now anyway, and this hallway is not the venue for a conversation about MI6. Oh, sorry, Angus. It's still early. I figured you wouldn't quite be asleep yet. After the day we had, I'm knackered. Nothing is quite so enervating as an interminable and mind-numbing meeting where people talk too much but say too little. All right then, lad, from the top, Angus said as he collapsed back on his bed. Well, 10 minutes ago, which would have been at 2050, I began in my most authoritative voice, but stopped when Angus lifted one eyebrow so high it threatened to break free from his forehead. What? I asked. 2050? Have you joined the military? I'm just trying to bring some clarity to the story's details and avoid any confusion. It just sounds a tad pretentious, and I fear it would soon be annoying. Annoying? Well, I don't know why. I've only been doing it since 2100, I said, checking my watch. Besides, I'm really just trying to get into the spirit of the evening. They always use the 24-hour clock in spy novels. James Bond never arrives 12 hours late for a secret rendezvous because MI6 uses the 24-hour clock. Oh, sorry, Daniel, did you say something? I must have drifted back to sleep there. Now, can you move the sheep into the shearing pen with a wee bit more alacrity? Of course, but I don't know why we have to bring sheep into this. Anyway, the text came into my personal cell phone, not my government-issued mobile. So the message was clean, off the grid, and off the books. Who are you spouting now, Tom Clancy or that Ludlam lad? Suffering, Daniel, get to the point. Okay, here's her text, I said, and I read, I was in the briefing with you today, the no longer young woman seated at the far side of the room and saying nothing. I'm MI6. Please meet me at 2200 at the Copper Cup Pub, back corner table, dark blue dress. It's important, strictly confidential, and very unofficial. While frightfully cliche, tell no one and do come alone. Well, Daniel, I didn't know how we're going to find you a dark blue dress to wear in the next hour. I think that's what she's going to be wearing. Ye gods, Daniel, can you not tell when I'm having you on? Right, sorry. I'm a little nervous and maybe a little excited. So where is this Copper Cup? I've not heard of it. Well, I Googled it. It's just around the corner from here. She must know where we're staying. Daniel, she's MI6. She probably knows what you had for breakfast and the brand of underwear you favor. And one thing's certain, you'll not be going on your own, a lamb to the slaughter. I'll be your... Angus snapped his finger in search of the right word. Watson? No, not him. Robin to my Batman? Certainly not. Sancho Panza? Ugh, no, there'll be no tilting at windmills tonight. Wingman? And that's my final offer. That's it. Wingman. I'll be your wingman. I wasn't sure a wingman was a good idea. On the other hand, two heads are better than one when venturing into uncharted waters. A paddle wouldn't hurt either. But her instructions were not to speak to anyone and to come alone. She might bolt if we both show up. No, I don't think so. Not if I arrive after you've already sat down. Besides, a few fingers of single malt would aid a smooth return to the horizontal when we get there. I replied to her text, agreeing to meet her. Then Angus and I cooked up a plan, or at least the pale imitation of something that approached the impression of a hazy semblance of a plan. And why don't I stop there? Now I think I have taxed your time quite a bit already, but delighted to answer questions that you might have now. So let me unshare my screen and we are back.
Wow, what a tour de force. A broad look at all the way back to where it all began with the best laid plans, and just a magnificent reading. Thank you so much. I'm in awe of what we were just watching.
Oh, come on.
One of the things that I love too is, so I do like audiobooks, but I also read along, and it brought me back to when I first listened to Best Laid Plans as a podcast, and to get the brogue, the back of the of Angus, that slight brogue that you bring to the reading. So that's fantastic.
Well, I'm glad that you actually called it a brogue, because I don't think I'm very good at it. And someone suggested it's a cross between Russian and French Canadian, but anyway, I'm doing my best.
It sounds great, and it takes us all back to that first novel. One of the things, and you've mentioned this in terms of the fact that at so many of your events, you would get the question of where's Angus? I'm wondering, when you sat down to come back to these characters, how did that feel? Did it feel like old friends? Did it take you a while to immerse yourself back into their thoughts? How did that process work for you?
That's Josh, that's a really good question and an insightful one, because I was really quite worried about it. I sort of decided, yeah, I'll write another Angus novel. And then I started to think about it and said, wait a second, I have not even read the first two novels in 11 years. And I wrote them even before that, obviously. So I had no idea whether I would find these characters in my mind when I went back to them. And what was so gratifying is that clearly those characters not only seem to have struck a chord with some Canadians, at least, they must have struck a chord with me, because I found them right where I had left them in my mind, and in my heart for that matter too. And I found it was just like putting on an old sweater, very comfortable, and they were right there, and they were speaking right away, and their personalities, I hope distinct as they are from one another, were right there. It was kind of like I was in a time machine. No time had passed. And that was so gratifying, and it made writing the novel so much easier. And I think I had forgotten or never really appreciated the impact these characters had on me, because they were clearly still enmeshed in my own brain somewhere. So it's a good question, because I was worried about it. And then after about, the first few days of sort of mapping out the story, I never even thought about it again, because they were right there.
Right. And one of I love the image of the well-worn shirt that's coming back on, that comfortability, but you do defamiliarize in the sense that you've taken on the spy genre. And you mentioned this in your remarks, that it's a new challenge for you. And I imagine the pace of writing a thriller is different than writing the political satire of the original. Did it take a bit of a translation in terms of, or a different type of writing to capture action? And I don't want to give too much away in terms of the scene, but that action right. Marks a difference from the first.
Yeah, and that's a really good question too, because I didn't really I didn't really know how to write a thriller. I just knew what I liked to read, and I don't read thrillers all the time. In fact, quite rarely these days, but I do enjoy them. So I did recognize that there needed to be some action in the story, and that you write action, if you want the action to have a real urgency and immediacy to it, you have to write it differently, perhaps, than the kind of sentences I often write. I'm very much from the why use 6 words when 12 will do school of writing. I like to splash around in the language. I'm a big fan of what a versatile gift the English language is. And I am not at the, Hemingway liked to pare everything down to its bare essence. And I find that often robs the words of their power in a way, even though he's trying to give them more power. So it's just a personal preference. Anyway, in my previous novel, Albatross, I had a bit of a dry run for the thriller aspects of it. There's a scene in that novel, and I won't give anything away, but it takes place on the roof of the Burj Al Arab Hotel in Dubai. And that was my first kind of blush with sort of a thriller idea and an action scene. And that was my dry run, if you will, because I had this new novel in my mind when I was writing that. So I did have a practice run on that, and then brought that idea into this novel. But certainly the plotting and the pacing, I'm always interested in and concerned about plotting and pacing, certainly because I do all of that, those decisions before I ever write the manuscript. But it was even heightened in this novel because I was worried about, I'm not even sure we should call it a thriller. I mean, I know I call it that, but it may not even come up to that standard. But I was trying to make it a little more interesting and exciting. So yeah, it was I did dwell on that in my thinking and planning more so than I had perhaps in previous novels, and also took perhaps greater care in those scenes that were less familiar to me than other scenes, just to make sure I'm not sure I got them right, but I wanted to make sure I was happy with how they flowed and the pacing was there.
Right.
I have no idea if I answered that question, Josh.
No, that was fantastic. The other thing I really love about the fact that you gave us that opening passage from the novel is the fact that we enter in medias res, or in the midst of the plot. So it feels like we're picking right up from where we were. And in terms of the time of the novel, it's about three months or 3 weeks or a couple months after. And then probably about a year from the best laid plans. But in the 13 years, so much has happened in our world. And one of the things that I think people really love, I love about the characters of Angus and Daniel, is the fact that they're oriented around a real sense of moral compass and ethicality and principle. And in that period, of course, as we all know, politics has undergone a real sense of distrust, probably something to do with the strange orange man in the big white house that maybe took some of our faith away from what politics is. When you approached this, did you have that sense of how they embody those values and how they become those characters that make us aspire to a better notion of political life?
Very much so. And it's one of the things I love about the Angus character. And Daniel, who is, I think, also a good person and upright and ethical, but he's gone through the wars and perhaps his censors aren't quite as acute in that area. But Angus is, I think that's why, I talked about Angus striking a chord with Canadians. That may be one of the reasons, because he is somebody we aspire to, or at least we want our politicians to aspire to be like him, I think. So yeah, I was quite aware of that. And Angus is Angus is Angus. And in whatever the situation is, whether it's in his political life or his personal life, or trying to thwart an assassination plot, his integrity, his commitment to his principles, his honesty is never going to waver. It's one of those, it's sort of fixed. And Daniel is affected by that as well. So yeah, I wanted that not to have changed at all in the 3 weeks since the previous novel ended, but
Yeah.
but he's a North Star in a way, and he will always be there, and that really helps me in his character, in writing him, because there are no real question marks about what he's going to do, um, and he just wants to do what's right always. So that's nice to have that recurring in various ways throughout the novel.
Absolutely. And also something that brings us to a notion of politics that I think people would love to see, and have that sense of comfortability coming back to that notion and the character of Angus. I see a question from Mindy Bullen. Do you think Sean Connery would have been a good Angus? I always I like that.
That is a great question, and except for the fact that Sean Connery is quite a bit taller, but I don't think that would matter. I think Sean Connery would have been just a great sort of actor to play that role. In the TV series, I think we had a great actor, Ken Welsh, and I'm going to be doing an event with him coming up at the Book Drunkard Festival in Uxbridge later this month. But other names that come up during the filming or the pre-production, the casting, they actually tried to see if Billy Collins would do it, who was the Scottish comic who was so funny, and they looked at Gordon Pinsent as well. And anyway, there are a few people they looked at, but I think I agree. Sean Connery would have been awesome. That would have allowed me to do my Sean Connery impression when I was reading the characters.
And you still could. There still would be opportunity. I see David Tennant is also somebody that's being mentioned in the chat here.
Yeah.
A great Billy Connolly. Yep, absolutely. Some great choices here. We should have the casting of CBC on the call right now to get all the suggestions for the next on-screen appearance. You mentioned Daniel too as having a certain quality to him as well that we need to have. When I read Daniel, I think of the line that I think is attributed to Otto von Bismarck, who's quoted as saying, "If you like laws and sausages, you should never watch either of them being made," because of that feeling of being jaded, as you described, that matched your own feeling. And this was the process that turned you to storytelling and fiction as a way of addressing what you thought was going wrong with policymaking. I was actually going back to the Best Laid Plans to listen to the podcast. And as you were going along, I noticed that at one point in time, you'd mentioned Alan Rock was somebody who had made an early comment about the novel. And it made me wonder whether other sausage makers, as it were, other lawmakers that you'd worked with in politics have read the books, and whether that had an impact that you might not have had if that had been in politics, but through storytelling.
Right. Well, I mean, I have spoken to many politicians who have read the novels, Bob Ray and Michael Ignatieff actually pulled me aside at a Politics in the Pen dinner in Ottawa, which is a Writers Trust fundraiser in Ottawa every year. And I get to go, which is so much fun. And this was long after he had surrendered his role as leader of the Liberal Party, or at least a couple of years after. But he called me over and he said, I read the Best Laid Plans during the year that I was leader and was under such pressure, and it was such not a fun time. And he said to me, the only time I laughed all year was when I read the Best Laid Plans. He had such a bad year. But he wrote me a note. It was so kind of him. He wrote me a note after the dinner to reiterate that story. Others have read it, and many of them have said that really cuts a little too close to the bone, a little too close to the bone, too close to reality. So anyway, I certainly had fun with it, and I think politicians most of them have enjoyed it. I hope, maybe privately, but
I'm going to pick a question here out of the chat from Colleen Morrow. She says, I so enjoyed catching up with Daniel Angus and company in Operation Angus. How do you think your main characters in any of your novels spent their COVID lockdowns?
Oh, that's a good question. I think Daniel or Angus probably spent them in his workshop, working on the hovercraft or other inventions that he might have been contemplating. Daniel, I think, may have started to write something on his own because he would like to be a writer, I think, at some point in his life. Some of my other characters, I think of my Landon Percival character in my Up and Down novel, who was the aging citizen astronaut, bush pilot doctor from Glacial Lake in BC. I imagine that the COVID didn't affect her very much at all because she would be spending that time living alone as she does on that glacial lake in northern British Columbia with no fear of ever contracting or conveying the disease because she was pretty well on her own there. Yeah, most of my characters, I think, if they're like me, and many of them are, have some attributes of me, though I'm not the characters, I'm very much a homebody. I have not minded spending most of my days in the very room in which you see me now. I write in this room. I still work in my day job in this room, and I'm quite content here. So,
absolutely. It's interesting. I was reading, and you touched upon the fact that you approach your writing process. It made me think of this because you're in your writing room. I suppose this is the room that you do write. Is this best that we're getting to the room where it happens, as it were? One of the things that I find interesting is that the fact that you've described uncertainty as not necessarily working well with your writing process. But it makes me think, and I'm going to quote another line here from the great romantic poet Keats on negative capability, where the idea of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without an irritable reaching after fact and reason. And it seems to me in some situations, it's the uncertainty that Angus has to confront, and his problem-solving engineering perspective that he brings to bear that solves problems but leads to further uncertainties. And I wonder in your writing process, even though you're trying to avoid that uncertainty, whether it's also a motor there, that there's certain uncertainties that come to you that you have to problem solve in your own writing.
Oh, absolutely. And uncertainty is certainly, in my mind, the enemy of my writing. I don't, if I'm uncertain about something, I really find it hard to write sentences without exactly knowing what's going to happen and where I'm going. So my basic approach is I don't start writing the manuscript until I have the story completely nailed 6 ways to Sunday and outlined in a chapter map, and then finally in an 80 to 90 page chapter by chapter bullet point version of the novel. Anyone online tonight could write a version of my novel with the outline that I have. Maybe it wouldn't be exactly the same, but yes, but early in the process, when I'm planning out the story and mapping it out and deciding what's going to happen, who's going to do what to whom and when, there is lots of uncertainty. And I know that because I'm not writing that. So there must be uncertainty. But yes, you have to confront that. And, often I will have difficulty getting from plot point C to plot point D. And I just need to solve that jump between those two parts of the story. And I've come to realize that if I sit down and say, okay, tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I have 2 hours set aside, I'm going to crack that problem, I will never solve it. That is not how my brain works. What I need to do is recognize the problem, identify it, and then let it just sit there in my brain pan where it steeps and ferments and turns over. And I have to just trust the process that at some moment when I'm not really expecting it, something will enter my head that will prove, if not the solution, at least it will illuminate the path to the solution. And I've never been disappointed by that. If I do it that way, if I just, as long as I have time to do it, if I'm not working on deadline or something, I'm usually well ahead of the deadline. So that's not usually an issue, but I could be out, I could be folding laundry, I could be walking to the store, I could be driving, any number of things. And something will emerge from the mists in my addled brain, and I will solve that problem. And I just have to give it time and space to breathe. So I cannot schedule it and then turn my mind to it and solve it. I wish it were that easy, but it just doesn't work that way. So that's how I deal with those uncertainties. If it's not obvious, I've just got to let it sit, and eventually I will come upon a solution. Often it means a transition scene that will take me more easily without a big, step function. It will take me more smoothly to that next plot point. But yeah, I'm still not a fan of uncertainty, but it does drive the story development. It's when I get to the writing where uncertainty is a big problem for me.
Absolutely. I've got a question here from Kevin Knight, and it links on to a writing question. I thought that no relation was a hilarious concept based on your process of writing. What you know, how did the concept of that book come, or where did that concept come from?
That is an easy question. I can tell you exactly what happened. And it was very early in my consulting career. So it probably happened when I was in my mid-20s, even though I didn't write that novel until I was probably in my 50s when I wrote the novel. But I had a client meeting downtown in a big glistening glass tower in Toronto, a major law firm, and this guy was a labor lawyer. One of our clients was in a bit of a labor dispute, and I had a meeting with him, and I was a public affairs consultant at the time. And I went into the meeting, and he stood up and came around his desk and said, "Hi, I'm Brian Mulroney." And obviously it was not that Brian Mulroney, because at the time I was doing this, that Brian Mulroney was residing at 24 Sussex Drive. So this was just a leading labor lawyer in Canada, minding his own business, who happened to have the same name as the prime minister, who was at the nadir of his public opinion at that time. And I remember thinking how unfortunate that he has that name. He can't go to a neighborhood barbecue or a conference or a meeting without someone, ribbing him with lines that probably weren't funny at all, and he would have heard them all. And I just tucked that story into my head, and clearly it had stayed for a long time, because I thought of him often, what it must be like to live with a famous name when you are not the famous person.
Yeah.
So
There's a great question here from Janet Armstrong, and Janet, I also love this element of Terry's writing in these books. I love the letters Angus writes to his beloved deceased wife, and think this is a wonderful device to give us insight into his thoughts and feelings. Are you able to tell us how you came up with this idea? I find the letters are real poignant in that diary that he does at the entries at the end of chapters.
Right. Yes, happy to share that with you. And it was, I'm very fond of them too. You'll notice that if you've read Operation Angus, you may know that there are fewer diary entries, and that in a way is to mark Angus's process through the grief cycle. And he even says it in his first diary entry. He says, I'm better. I'm feeling better. I'm learning how to assimilate the grief. It will never be gone, but he's learning how to assimilate it. Anyway, but in the first novel, the reason it came up is that Daniel is not always a reliable narrator. He doesn't always know exactly what's going on. And my fear when you're writing in the first person through someone's eyes like Daniel's is that the reader would only view Angus as a monosyllabic, taciturn, crusty old Scot, and you wouldn't know that there are deeper waters there. So I needed a device, at least until Daniel really got to know him. But I needed a way to show readers that this is a more complicated man whose heart is broken, perhaps irretrievably broken. And the device I came upon was, and it perhaps is a bit convenient. You know, when you write in the first person, you don't usually expect to find someone else's diary entry at the end of each chapter. But I was, you know, it was the first time I'd written anything. I didn't know really why that was not such a great idea. I actually still like them, but so I wanted to show the real Angus in his own voice, to show that there are deeper waters there, so that we didn't have to learn about him only through Daniel's perhaps not clear vision.
Yeah.
So that's how that happened. And the challenge with them is not to be repetitive, both in his interaction with his departed spouse, but also in conveying what's happening in the story. If something has just happened in the chapter, I didn't want to rehash that in the diary entry. So I had a bit of a general rule, which is not always followed, was that something in the diary entry had to advance the story in some way. And it may be why there are fewer of them in this novel, but I still wanted the device there. And you get a chance to see a deeper Angus, a more compassionate, thoughtful Angus, and someone who is capable of love and grief.
Right, and it also showcases something of your writing, which is the strong female characters, strong older female characters who have such a presence in your work. One of the things that I find so compelling about those diary entries too is how powerful Maren Lee's presence is, even though she's absent. She's thought so highly about by everyone in the books, and I've wondered when I was reading this is whether we would ever see Maren emerge in a future piece of writing. Whether, and of course that sounds like it couldn't happen because she's passed on, but would there ever be an opportunity to write her from her own perspective?
You know, it's an outstanding idea, and I have thought for a while about some kind of a prequel to the Best Laid Plans, where we would see a younger Angus and how he meets Maren, and we learn a bit about how they meet in the high road, and they literally meet handcuffed back to back in a paddy wagon because they've both been arrested at a pro-choice rally on Parliament Hill shortly after Angus has come from Scotland. And he never even saw who he was being handcuffed to, and nor did she. And they talked to one another in the back of this paddy wagon, back to back, handcuffed to one another, and fell in love with one another in a way without even seeing one another's faces. And so I wrote that part into the high road. So I know how they meet, but I think it's an interesting idea. Now, whose perspective would I write it from? Because these novels are always from Daniel's perspective, but of course Daniel doesn't. No, he's not in the play. So I'd either have to write it from Maren Lee's perspective or from Angus's. And as much as I would like to try to do it from Maren Lee's, I don't think, I'm not sure a man could do that as well as I would want to. In other words, who am I to write from the perspective of a woman coming from my white male privilege? So I would probably end up writing it from Angus's perspective, which would be kind of interesting. So, and that's not a pledge or a promise or a plan. It's just an idea I've often had, and you know, I like their love story, and at some point maybe we will find out a bit more about them, because she is an interesting character, I think, even though she only makes sort of spot appearances.
Right. Though I think you're being modest in the sense that you write such terrific female characters, and I'm thinking in your remarks to begin, you talked about speaking to the CSIS operative as a way of giving you guidance. And in the novel, we were introduced to a new character, Vivian, who has such gravity and such grace. And I'm wondering too how that decision came to. Was that a connection to the CSIS operative discussing with you some of that, and that's how it kind of made it into the novel?
No, it didn't really come from that. But you will know, because you have kindly read my novels, you will know of my penchant for having strong older women characters in important roles, which is without proselytizing too much, has been a bit of an agenda I have had to redress the diminished role that older women seem to played in our literature and in society and in life in general. Once you turn 65, our wisdom tends to be discounted and sometimes discarded. So I included her as part of that effort on my part. But also, I don't know if there are going to be any more Daniel and Angus novels. I honestly don't know. But Muriel is getting on in years, and I don't know how long she can be around in the future. And I actually make reference to that in this novel towards the end, that she's not what she once was, and Lindsay is concerned about that, her grandmother. So I wanted to introduce another character who might have might carry on afterwards. Who knows? But I am very fond of the Vivian character, and I had fun with her. So Phil Gursky, that CSIS guy, didn't bring that up. I already had that in my mind, but I think what I learned from him helped me make her role more realistic.
Right. A question that came in from Colin Thacker: would you consider writing about Angus as Prime Minister? This, I imagine this is a question that you've maybe tossed in your mind.
Yes, and that's my friend Colin Thacker from North Bay. Hello, Colin. Good of you to tune in. Angus as Prime Minister, that would be interesting. And my thought on that is that it might just be too pat, almost too inevitable to start there and then make him Prime Minister. And it's kind of why he's not a senior cabinet minister in this novel, because that's not what would happen. He'd be a junior minister his first time out. And it's possible, but my fear is that he'd have to withstand so much of the vagaries and travails of traditional politics to get there. He'd have to run a leadership convention. He would have to do things that he would not like doing at all. I mean, he's never campaigned, really. He did campaign in his second election, but not the way other people campaign. So I will never say never, but my instinct would be, it would just seem too nice of a fit, and I'm not sure I'd want to go quite that far with it, but we'll see.
That's terrific. There's a comment too from Colin. I thought I'd read this out because I think it links to another point that were some of the things that we're missing in our pandemic times. He says, Terry has had a profound impact on literacy amongst Indigenous peoples in Guatemala. He attended an event in North Bay, Ontario called Dine with the Author. Thank you, Terry, for helping Rotarians in North Bay. And it speaks to the fact of your incredible, you mentioned 1,000 speaking events and how engaged you are as an author going to speak to these groups. And I imagine COVID has grounded us in a certain way. How has that been for you as an author, dealing with these times that we're in right now?
Well, it's sort of a double-edged sword in a way, Josh, because it has perhaps allowed me to reach more people in farther flung parts of Canada. Zoom has been kind of it came along at the right time, and it works very well. And tonight is one example, as I looked through and saw how far afield people are tuning in. That's really that's amazing. On the other hand,
yes.
I really do miss being in front of an audience and being able to see their faces and hear them laugh or not laugh when I might want them to laugh. But I learn a lot, and that feedback is so important. So this is kind of a sterile, antiseptic approach, but I heartily admit that it's better than not meeting at all, and I've been very thankful for it. So I've done lots of events, lots of events. I just haven't done anything outside of this house, really, except for I've done 2 events now as we begin to emerge from this dark period. I did an event here in Toronto, an indoor event with 40 or 50 people, and it was the first time I had really had an audience in front of me and who I could play off of and who could react, and that was such a welcome return to that. I did another outdoor event in the parking lot of a bookstore in Coburg before things opened up, so we were all socially distanced. But even that was such a blessing because I could see them and they could ask their own questions in their own voice, and we could sign some books afterwards. So I do miss that. And as effective and efficient as Zoom is and far reaching, I long for the day when we can do sort of maybe hybrid events where we can go to a festival and have an audience and, in a way what you're, I think, planning on doing at some point, and yet have an audience, but also have it zooming out to others who can't actually be there. And what a nice compromise that would be.
Absolutely. And I think the comments coming in from the chat testify to the impact that you've had as an author, from people all over Canada describing the impact that you've had in terms of the events that you do. And what would be an estimate of how many events that you've done in a year, as when we were pre-pandemic period?
Pre-pandemic, because I know this now because this guy gave me a year by year
calculated
breakdown, and I noticed that my high water mark was 142 events. Wow. Now that, to be clear, that can be, a book club would be an event, or an appearance at a festival, or a library talk, or a service club, community club talk. So they're not all big events. Some of them are really quite small, but I sort of put them on my website, my appearances page, really because I rely on it to get me there on the right day. But also, in a way, it's a record of this odyssey that I feel like I'm on, having started it later in life. I mean, I was 45 when I wrote The Best Laid Plans. I was 48 when it came out, and it was a most unexpected turn in my life. And at our age, we now understand the wisdom of kind of tracking these things and recording them and chronicling them in a way. So I use my website as a way to help me capture this journey that I've been on since 2008. And so I forget how I got on that stream of thought, but it's nice to have it there. So I can always look back. I can see, what did I do in 2009? And I can look through my whole list of speaking engagements and remember many of them. So it's kind of fun.
Absolutely. We're getting close to our time, but you teased us in a way that I can't help but jump on this as the questioner on behalf of everybody, and somebody mentioned it in the chat as well. You teased a little bit that there's a 9th in the works. Is there anything that you can tell us a little bit about that? I hate to say that because 8 is 8, but...
No, I can tell you a little bit about it. It's one thing I've never done. The challenge I set for myself in this novel is to write a narrator who is my own age. And Josh, you and I were talking about my wrestling with aging before we came on live, but and I told you I'm going to be 62 next month, and I don't feel 62. It's a shock to my system that I am 62. So this novel will be written by a 62-year-old narrator in a post-COVID world. It'll be dealing with aging. It'll be dealing with male friendship. And there will be a bit of recovery from grief in it. There'll be some music in it, including some original songs. It will be set in Toronto and in Paris. So I've never written about music before, but it's been a part of my life since I was 17 and picked up the guitar. And so I've been playing guitar and played in bands and written dozens of songs, none of which have seen the light of day. But it's not I'm not of that caliber, but it's a big part of my life. So I'm going to write a bit about music in this novel, just because I know about that, having done it for so many years. My only claim to fame musically would be that the lead singer in our band in university was Andy Mays, who went on to become and is still the lead singer in the Skydiggers, which is, now, people may not know who the Skydiggers are, but if you know them, you love them. They are a cult band in Canada. So he remains a friend. And someone just typed in, "Love the Skydiggers." Thank you.
All right.
So we like to say we gave him his start because we auditioned him. I was the previous singer, and that will explain why we were auditioning for a new singer. But so anyway, it was lots of fun. Most fun I had in my life was playing in a band. So I'm going to get a bit of that into the novel. Plus my love of Paris is there. So all of that's going to come together, I hope, in a coherent, cohesive way, but we'll see.
Absolutely. I did not know about the musical background. Is it something that you still do? You still play music?
Well, if I turn this, you might be able to see the guitar over there.
There it is. There it is. My goodness. I'd be almost tempted to get an outgoing song, but
no, I don't think that will happen. But yes, well, yeah, I have 3 or 4 guitars, and both my sons play in bands, and so music is still in our household.
Absolutely, and it's a great way to be creative during the times that we've been in. And right. I think somebody just said here, 62 is still young. Happy birthday to come. So there we go.
Thank you.
That's a very affirmative comment. Well, I thank you. We're over the time that we've allotted tonight. This has just been such a wonderful visit, such a great way to start the Words Festival 2021. You're one of our favorite guests that comes to the festival. I'm going to hold up the book that you all should go out and buy, Operation Angus. It was just such a terrific opportunity to chat with you, Terry, and at some point in time, I'm going to have to, when you come back, my dad can come and get a signed copy, because you're definitely his favorite author, and that's something that's come from the pandemic as well. So thank you very much.
I'd be thrilled to meet him, and I look forward to that. And congratulations on the festival. You got 25 great days coming up. I hope those who are tuned in now will be tuning in for other events as well. So I'm really honored to be kicking things off. So thank you again, and next time in person.
Absolutely. I threw the website to the festival in the chat, so go and check out our schedule. But for now, thank you so much, Terry Fallis. Thank you to everybody who joined us. At the top of our event, when I asked where everybody was from, you could see that we had a coast-to-coast audience, which is one of those silver linings of our unusual times. But we'll soon be back to normal and in person. And in the meantime, we hope to see you for the rest of November, everybody tuning in. And happy birthday to come, Terry. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you all very much. That was great. Nice to be with you, and all the best. We'll see you soon.
Have a good night, everyone.